today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to talk about fractals. And we have that as our cover story in the January edition of Prophecy in the News magazine, Fractals, the Intelligence of God's Design. Now, we pose the question, is creation a series of divine algorithms? By asking this question, we're not trying to cheapen God's creation. Gary Stimman is here to discuss what I think is one of the most absolutely fascinating discoveries of the 20th century, fractal design.
Without a doubt, whether you know it or not, fractals have changed your life. When you watch television, when you look at certain kinds of pictures, when computer-generated ideas are presented to you, invariably fractals are involved in the process. A fractal, JR, was the invention of a mathematician by the name of Benoit Mandelbrot. In 1975, he wrote a book called Fractals, Form, Chance, and Dimension, in which he essentially publicized some relatively simple mathematical formulas which generated shapes that repeated themselves on an infinite basis. And I'm sure that many of you know what we're talking about. We'll be showing you various pictures of fractal designs as we go through this program. JR, God's creation. I think Benoit Mandelbrot may have pointed us in the direction, in a very remote way, in the direction of God's creation.
This is Mandelbrot's primary design. You can see it here. It looks sort of like a beetle. The point of this fractal is that if you go with a microscope down to the smallest part of this fractal design, you can see that the smallest part is identical to the whole. So no matter how small you get, the algorithm that was used in the computer that made that shows how simple it was. A simple mathematical geometric algorithm created that incredible design.
Now, you just used a big word, and a lot of people out there say, what did JR say? Algorithm? What do we mean by algorithm? You know, JR, that's just basically a $16 word for an instruction. An algorithm is just a little instructional package. You can write some numbers and characters and enter those in a computer, and it tells the computer what to do. So an algorithm is a set of instructions, or a very small instruction.
Now we've got, under Mandelbrot's picture here, we've zoomed in to show you the complexity of it, and yet such a simple algorithm caused the computer to do that. Anyway, underneath this picture, I have this. When asked how a computer builds a fractal design, Benoit Mandelbrot said, it starts with a geometric figure called the initiator and a mathematical rule called an algorithm. Taking the iterative function f parentheses z in parentheses equals z times 2 plus c on the complex plane, where z and c represent complex numbers. This is what happens. And he goes through this little algorithm here, and he said the computer can do these calculations at a very rapid pace. Isn't that amazing? Just put in a simple algorithm and the computer builds it.
Yeah, and the point is not that you understand those numbers, because basically there are very few of us who have studied higher math. The point is that it's a relatively simple formula, and the dictionary definition reflects this idea. The Oxford American Dictionary defines a fractal as a curve or geometric figure, each part of which has the same character as the whole. Fractals are useful in modeling structures such as eroded coastlines or snowflakes. The Encarta World English Dictionary defines a fractal as an irregular or fragmented geometric shape that can be repeatedly subdivided into parts, each of which is a smaller copy of the whole. So you have something that can grow infinitely large or infinitesimally small, and it doesn't change. It remains the same.
Now, the reason we're excited about fractals is that in 1623, Galileo said, quote, philosophy is written in this grand book, I mean, the universe, which stands continuously open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering about in a dark labyrinth. Now, this was 1623. He is saying here that the universe is made up of simple algorithms, fractal designs. Now, please understand, we're not trying to cheapen creation here, but what we are saying is when God created the universe, He simply used 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet to make all of this grand design. Just simple algorithms could build it all.
And J.R., the Jews before Christ used to talk about the Word, and the Word of creation. And they said that God spoke creation into existence with the Word. And a simple Galilean fisherman by the name of John talked about the Word as the creative device. And then he said in John 1:14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. In other words, J.R., couldn't we call the Word an algorithm? And couldn't we call the flesh the result of the algorithm?
You know, it was the Greek philosophers who said that the world is not real, that it is a made up something, that just a product of imagination. What he was trying to say, I think, is that it's software. It's not hardware.
Yeah.
Now, mankind does not have the machine that builds electrons, protons, neutrons, etc., and atoms. We can't build these things. God did. God has some kind of a device by which, and I don't mean to belittle God's ability to create out of nothing. That's exactly what He did, however, and He spoke it into existence. It is software. In fact, the rabbi's going to say that if the Lord ever turned off the switch or stopped speaking these things and holding them together, they would immediately evaporate.
That is absolutely true, and by the way, that's reflected in the first chapter of the book of Hebrews, as well as the first chapter of the book of John, both of which assert that this universe was created out of nothing and is upheld by the Word of God. And so rather than simplifying God by likening these fractals or showing how fractal design actually created our physical world, we are glorifying God. You know, fractal design, J.R., is a way for us human beings to perceive a design parameter. And every time I look at these things, I think how beautiful and clever God was in His design.
Yeah. Here's a head of broccoli, and you'll see the spiral design on the large areas of the head, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as it goes out toward the end. But those smaller things are just as perfect as these larger details. And this is the beauty of a fractal design.
Yeah, and J.R., and I will have that on the screen for you as we speak, and the beauty of this little infant, I guess, this little sprout of broccoli, is that it looks artificial. I mean, you could almost say to somebody, I designed this on the computer. And they wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Well, that's the amazing thing. This repetitive design motif is what you're looking at when you go outdoors. You see trees, you see flowers that have regularity, you see branching trees. Those are fractals, and that's amazing.
Now, scientists, once Benoit Mandelbrot produced his theory, scientists began to toy with it in a computer, and finally they got together and had symposiums over this, and Hollywood caught hold of it. The designs of movies inside computers became possible. We're talking only in the last, 25, 30 years?
Well, it was 1982. There was a hallmark in history. For those of you who are film fans, there was a sci-fi movie called Tron. And I think a lot of kids, and some of them have grown up, and they would be 25 to 30 years old today, maybe a little over 30, and they remember a computer world built. And the idea of the film called Tron is that inside this computer, there was an entire electronic world. And the protagonist of the story in Tron actually becomes computerized himself, enters into the computer, and goes in there and fights the good fight against an evil computer being who dwells inside the computer. Well, JR, that was a revolutionary idea. It was the first time anyone had ever postulated the idea of a living design electronically created.
But you know, Gary, it wasn't the first time it happened. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us.
Wow.
The Word became flesh. Now, that's some kind of a, forgive me for, I don't mean to be cheapening this concept, but, you know, when Jesus healed blinded eyes and made the deaf to hear and the lame to walk, he could do it in a split second because he's, I don't mean to belittle it by calling him the computer programmer, but in our finite minds, that's about the closest we can get to what really happened.
The grand designer.
Yes.
And you know, JR, let's suppose someone comes to you who was born blind. That individual has never seen. His eyeballs are atrophied. The neural connections between those atrophied eyeballs and the brain has never carried a single impulse. The brain itself has never learned to interpret neural impulses so as to create a picture inside the mind. And so when you heal that person, not only do you have to give him a set of new eyeballs and a set of new optic nerves, you got to program his brain so that he can process pictures. Only the grand designer could do that.
Yes. Now, on 60 Minutes, there was a segment on reading men's minds. In an MRI machine, they were able to process a photograph, live running effect of the photograph of a brain and the way it functions inside, lights up certain areas of the brain, and they show a picture to this person of a hammer, and it's processed in the brain, and no matter who it was, it's processed to look exactly the same in every person's brain, which means, Gary, that one brain is not different from another brain. It all uses the same program, as, so to speak. And it's some kind of an electronic program so that they can now tell you what you're looking at or what you're thinking about. If you think of a hammer, they already have a computer program that processes the brain and says, he's thinking of a hammer. It's amazing.
It is, and what it suggests is that design, as conceived by God on this earthly plane, is repetitive. It is fractal in the sense that it's made of infinitely repeating component parts that can be discerned in a particular way. This incredible design is suggestive of a very high mind, not some accidental evolutionary explosion, a big bang, or some little thing growing in the muck and the mire that then becomes more and more complicated and becomes a human being. It's a grand design, and there's no mistaking it.
You know, even in our computers, we don't use alphabets. We create alphabets out of two simple things. We call them zeros and ones, but actually it's light, dark. Light, dark, light, dark.
Sure.
Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And so when God spoke, let there be light, that was the foundation of what we even call computer designs today.
Indeed. This is no accident, this world. It has intelligent design.
Yes. Now, on page 6 and page 7 of the article, we show a picture here of the spiral design of a snail or a sea creature. And then we show the spiral design of a galaxy over here.
Yes.
Gary, it's the same design. We showed the spiral design of the broccoli here on page 3 of the magazine.
Right.
It's can be reproduced in a computer today using a simple algorithm.
Yes.
So when Galileo said that the universe is made up, that in fact he says it's written in a language.
Yes.
And the language is geometry.
Now, Galileo didn't have the word algorithm. He said language. We might just as well say algorithm. In other words, there is a set of instructions. That set of instructions creates what we perceive as life and as the physical world.
Well, atoms are made up of instructions.
Yes.
And DNA is made up of instructions. And so everything has intelligent design, friend. I want you to know that God spoke the worlds into existence, and it wasn't all that complicated. Oh, it's far more complicated than we will ever be able to understand. In fact, Gary, read us the last sentence you have on your article there, just to give us a feel for the grandeur of it, and the fact that in this article we are not trying to cheapen creation, but to show its beauty and grandeur.
I conclude the article, which is a rather long article and complex, but I conclude it in a very simple way by writing this. When the Lord spoke, his utterances were what we now understand to be algorithms. To realize this is not to understand it, but to be awed by it.
Yes. So what I want you to understand on this program is that when Jesus spoke the worlds into existence, and he did it in some kind of series of algorithms, either spirals or some kind of rectangles, some kind of geometric designs. Now, let me just give you an idea here. This is page 8 of the article. We have a tree here, a trunk and 3 branches off of that tree. But if you'll follow one of the branches out, you'll find another set of branches. It looks like a trunk with 3 branches spiraling off from it. In other words, what you see out here is the miniature of the whole. And so it was not all that complicated for God to make a tree or a bush or a snail or a galaxy. It's just incredible. And Gary, do you remember when John saw the Lord Jesus in Revelation chapter 1? And when Jesus spoke to him, his words took on form and shape. He said it looked like a 2-edged sword proceeding out of his mouth.
Yes.
We can't comprehend something like that, but what he's really saying is this is the process by which he created the universe.
In other words, our speech as human beings cannot create. We're not on that level. He is on such a level that his speech can actually be formed into what we would perceive as a solid object. And John saw a sword coming out of his mouth. That's all that John could say. There was something about his speech that formed a substance or something substantial. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about an algorithm.
Yes. Now, you know, the atom is made up of electrons and protons and neutrons and quarks and no telling what all else. But it is made up of something that doesn't even touch itself. No part touches any other part, but there's some kind of a force field there that makes it into solid objects, so that this tabletop right here appears to be solid, and yet we know that it is not solid because it's made up of atoms. Well, Gary, mankind has been able in a computer using only electrons, and by the way, we didn't create the electrons, we just used them to make in a computer similar designs to what God has made, and using fractals, these fractal design algorithms, Hollywood has been able to create worlds such as Star Trek to the Wrath of Khan and Jurassic Park and the Star Wars series that was created in a computer, and on and on and on. Worlds inside a computer.
Worlds inside a computer, and by the way, the most brilliant computer programmers couldn't really create those artificial worlds until Benoit Mandelbrot gave them the fractal. That gave them the little key to be able to create things like mountains. You can create a mountain or a cloud or a tree or a leaf or a snail. If you've seen Disney productions, Pixar productions, the computer design productions, and sometimes you're amazed at how real things look. For example, artificial hair flows like real hair. Well, how do they do that? Well, they use fractal formulas entered into a computer.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
Now let's get down to the real thing here. These fractals, of course, are just a representation of God's reality, how God put everything together. This is what I came across in 2004. Scientists working on DNA, the human genome, are stumped at a new discovery. This article says, when inspecting the genetic code of chickens, mice, and humans, they were surprised to find many identical chunks of DNA. These expert evolutionists were stumped that the junk sections across these three different species were exactly 100% the same, with absolutely no changes in what they believed to be 75 million years. How can this be? They must have changed a little at least, but no, this code is so vital that even 75 million years of evolution and these mammals could not tinker with it. Before now, scientists had a rather narrow opinion about which parts of the genome were important. They thought that only the important genes were codes for proteins, the building blocks of life. A few other sections that regulate gene function were also considered useful, but the rest of the strands were thought to be junk. Well, David Hostler of the University of California compared the genome sequences of man with the mouse and chicken and found to his astonishment that several great stretches of DNA were identical across the three species. Now, you got to understand that this was not just a few little chunks of DNA. There were over 480 chunks of DNA that are identically the same. And these chunks are not just little chunks. They have, each of these chunks has at least 200 base pairs in length. So in other words, it's a pretty big, hefty piece of DNA, and they are identical, whether it be a chicken, a mouse, or a human. Now, what this says is, when God created these things, I could just imagine God said, I think I'll use this here in the chicken.
Yeah.
Well, you know, that would be good in the mouse, too. I'll just use this here in the mouse. Well, you know, when I'm creating man, I think I'll just use this same DNA inside the human genome. God really, even though it's complicated and we don't understand creation, it's not all that complicated for God.
As you read that article, I sat here listening to you and thinking, now that scientist who's describing that chicken DNA sounds genuinely perplexed. He's wondering why these chunks show up in different places. I come from a family of designers. Some of my forebears were architects, some were aeronautical engineers, some were civil engineers. And JR, you take a principle of design, you can build a bridge, you can build an airplane, you can build a car, you can build an air conditioning system using little chunks of design that you have developed over the years. And you've tried them and you've proven them, and some of them may well go into the structure of a bridge, some of them may well work in an airplane. I think that you're talking about the same thing.
Well, you know, the gear could be found in a clock or it could be found in an engine.
Right. Absolutely.
It's the same gear, same kind of design. So this is absolutely a fascinating article. I hope you'll get it. It's the January edition of Prophecy in the News magazine. Read this incredible article for yourself. Be amazed at the intelligence of God's designs. Is creation a series of divine algorithms? I guess we would have to come down on the side of yes. God used 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet to make everything there is in the universe, and he continually holds these things together. The atom, where these little electrons, whether they flow around like a solar system around the nucleus or not, whatever it is, It's there because God continues to let it be there. But he could flip a switch. He could say stop. He could say, like on the holodeck, of Star Trek,
oh, yeah,
computer in program. And boy, I mean to tell you, it would end in an instant.
And there it goes.
That's what the rabbi said.
And J.R., there was a very famous rabbi in the 19th century. His name was Israel ben Eliezer. He's called the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov, talking about the Word of God, said, he refers to the verse in Genesis 1:6 where the Lord said, let there be a firmament. Yehi rakia, let there be a firmament. And the Baal Shem Tov said, with these words the heaven came into existence at a primeval instant. But what prevents the heaven from aging and decaying and crumbling? Why shouldn't the heaven grow stale like yesterday's loaf of bread or crumble like the last century's highways? Well, the psalmist, says the Baal Shem Tov, answered these questions when he said, forever, O Lord, your word stands firm in heaven. That rabbi was intelligent. And he saw that the word was what we would call the algorithm. And the psalmist says, forever your word stands in heaven. He not only creates it, he keeps it going.
Amazing.
It is.
This is an absolutely amazing subject, and we just touched on it today. I tell you, this concept of fractal designs shows the intelligent design of creation. The intelligence that went into designing everything that there is, whether it's a snail or a head of broccoli or a galaxy. God made it all. And he made it so simply. To him, Gary, it was so simple he just spoke.
That's right.
It into existence.
He spoke. In other words, he uttered what we would call an algorithm.
Yes.
And to say that is not to disrespect the Lord. It's to say on our very lowly basis that we honor him and give him the glory for the creation. And may it continue forever and ever in his light.
And as Daniel was told, in the end time knowledge would increase. Scientists today and movie makers with the computers have been able to delve deeply into the simple designs of algorithms and make worlds inside computers. Well, I want you to know that one of these days when we pass from this life, whether it be the rapture or death, we will enter into the real world of heaven. And I urge you to trust in Jesus Christ as your Savior because he wants to take you there. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.